Hey everyone, it's Jake and Scott with Case Binge. Today we're running a full market entry case called Mike Apparel.
Thanks to the Ross Consulting Club for giving us this case. It's a super good intermediate case for you to run. We put pauses in the video to make the case interactive so you can use this as your actual case practice. And remember to stick around for the feedback at the end of the video.
You can grab a pen and paper or just sit back and watch. You got this, you're gonna do great. Let's get into it. Great, let's get into the case.
That sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so our client, Mike Apparel, is a large apparel and sporting goods company. And the client is interested in entering the women's golf apparel market and is looking for guidance on whether or not this is a good idea.
Okay. Is there any specific reason that women's golf apparel is what we're looking at right now?
So that's a good question. Our objective is to invest extra cash, we don't know exactly how much, into a profitable project. So just trying to put this cash somewhere.
Okay. Do we operate globally or are we within the US?
Just US. Just
okay.
US.
Okay, so just to recap, we're working with Mike Apparel, large sporting goods store, apparel, think of something like an academy.
Yep.
They're looking into entering the women's golf apparel market.
Yep. And
basically their whole goal is just to invest extra cash that they already have on hand into something profitable. And we only operate within the United States. Are there any other objectives I should be aware of?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Do you mind if I have a few moments just to gather my thoughts?
Of course.
Great, thank you. All right. So taking a look at this, I feel like I can see this from a few different angles. So first, there's the women's golf apparel market. I think it's important that we look at the size of this market, the trends. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? And then who the customer base is for the women's golf apparel market. We also want to look at our own company. Who are our customers for our client, for Mike Apparel? What kind of production do we have in place, or any processes? Is it going to be easy for us to ramp up to women's golf apparel? Or are these entirely new processes? Again, I suspect it's probably fairly similar because we're doing other apparel already, but something to look into for sure. And then cost to enter. We have to figure out what research and development has to be done in order to design these products and produce them, whether there's any specific technologies that we have to include in the production as well. And then also just the cost of acquiring customers. Hopefully that wouldn't be too dramatic, knowing people already come to us for apparel, and so it's a natural next step to come to us for women's golf apparel. But something that we shouldn't ignore. My hypothesis, though, is that it's probably best focused on the women's golf market, primarily on size and trends, just because that's going to have the biggest impact on the profitability, on how much revenue can we actually achieve to offset our costs and make this a good use of our extra cash.
Yeah, so our client actually does want to look at the market, so that's a perfect place to start. And specifically, we're trying to estimate the total size of the women's golf apparel market. And so we think, given we're a large apparel and sporting goods company, that we can capture 20% of the market.
Okay.
And so given that 20% number, I want you to just try to estimate, based on your assumptions, how large is this market?
Interesting. Okay. That's funny. I've always just, I guess, qualitatively thought about, which of my friends play golf, but it's an interesting question of, how many people nationwide actually will play golf. And so I guess a way to think about it I would think about, the total U.S. market, and then I would want to figure out from that, narrow it down to total number of women in the U.S., and then from that, those kind of in the age range. Obviously, you want to exclude people that are, very small children, and then you want to exclude people that are, elderly, and so narrow it down to, U.S. women within the right age range, and then golf is definitely a more expensive sport. I know some sports are pretty easy to adopt for anyone. Basketball, you just go get a basketball, you find a local hoop. Golf is a bit different. I know in my own experience, I've only gone a few times, and usually I've been kind of upset about how much I had to pay. And so I know there's definitely a limiting factor of people that are willing and also just able to pay for clubs, for memberships, for even just a single round of golf. And so within that, I would kind of want to look at the kind of those without economic barriers. And then from that, not everyone who can play golf, who fits in the age range, et cetera, actually plays. And so I would want to narrow that down to those that actually play. And then after that, I would apply the capture rate of 20%. And so just to start, kind of zooming back out to the very top, is it fine to assume about 300 million people in the United States? Okay, so if there are about 300 million people in the United States, safe to assume about 50% of them are women. So that narrows that down to 150 million women in the United States. It's a bit interesting to guess who is not in the age range. Granted, I've seen some pretty small children play golf. And so I think the age range on the bottom end is a little bit lower even than I naturally think. And then lots of people play golf well into their 60s and maybe even 70s. And so would it be safe to assume about 80% of people?
I think that's a good number.
Great. So if about 80% of people fit within the age range, we would just do 150 million times 80. And so 15 times 8, 5 times 8 is 40. Carry that over, that will be 12. And so about 120 million women in the United States in the age range that we're looking at. And then this is where this is going to be more of an assumption right there of who economically is able and willing to pay to play golf. Like I mentioned, there's costs for country clubs, but then on even the smaller end where my friends go play around, they find the cheapest course, but it's still fairly expensive. Would it be, I figure among the people I've been around, I guess, kind of even in the college atmosphere, maybe 20% of people are willing and able to pay on a consistent basis to play, and that might be a little bit overblown because the college demographic tends to skew a little bit more towards the wealthy side than in general. Would it be fine if I assumed about 10% of people economically are willing and able to play?
Yeah, 10% is a great number.
Okay, and so that would bring us from 120 million down to 10 million or 12 million, pardon me, and then the actual number of those that play. Not everyone actually wants to play any given sport. I feel like of the people I know who, physically are in an age range where they're able to swing a club, willing to spend the money, I feel like even among that, it's maybe about a quarter of the people, 1 out of every 4, actually end up playing. And so if I take that assumption, that would bring us down to about 3 million people in the total market size. But again, you asked what could we actually capture, and if we have a capture rate of 20%. 3 times 2 is going to be 6, and so it'll bring us down from 3 million down to 600,000 people in our specific capturable market size for women's golf apparel.
Great. Okay, yeah. So we have this 600,000 number. Now that we have this market size, I want to look at the revenue potential as well as the break even. So I have some numbers I'm going to give you, Scott, and this kind of goes over some financials, and I want you to go ahead and tell me how much money we could make per year given these financials, and then how long is it going to take for Mike Apparel to break even?
Got it. Great, thank you so much. So taking a look at this, it looks like we're primarily just selling 2 items, shirts and hats, which makes it a little bit simpler for us right now.
Yep.
It looks like right here we have the buying frequency of, people buy 2 shirts per year and 1 hat per year, and then the selling price and the variable costs. So if we are looking at shirts, it looks like, is it fine already if I go ahead and jump to profit potential, I guess, for annual profit versus just annual revenue?
Yes, I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, and so looking at that, I'm going to go ahead and start on the per item level. And so shirts sell for $60 but have $15 variable costs, so we're making $45 of profit per shirt. And then on the hat side, $80 with $20 off of costs, and so that made $60 per hat. Now we want to think about this from an average customer standpoint, so that way we can apply it to the 600,000 average customers in our market. The average customer, it sounds like, buys 2 shirts per year, so that'd be $90 worth of profit, and then only 1 hat per year, so $60 of profit there, which means the average customer is going to bring us in $150 of profit annually, which sounds really encouraging right off the bat. That is one thing that I know is nice about some of the more expensive sports, is that for those that are selling the products, it's not necessarily more expensive to produce them. As you see, our variable costs are pretty low, but people are usually willing to pay more for it. So that is encouraging to see that $150 per profit per customer, and now I want to multiply that by our 600,000, and so 15 times 6 right there, that's 30. Carry that over, that's 90, and so that would be 90 million annually, and so we could have 90 million in annual profit, but that doesn't take into account these numbers right here, and so right there it looks like our fixed costs, we've already attributed the variable costs in the per item basis, and so when we take out our $5 million of annual fixed costs, on an annual basis, we're pulling in $85 million in annual profit. Of course, you asked also for the break even, and in order to figure that out, we want to look at the research and development costs. Those are really the only costs listed as initial startup costs, and so I'm going to take that $255 million and divide that by how much annual profit we'll get each year, and so that's divided by 85 million, and so thinking 85, 8 times 2 is 16, so that's definitely be more than 2 years. 8 times 3 is 24. And then, the 5 times 3 is 15, and so that's actually fits in perfectly. And so 3 years is the exact break-even time in which we will go from recovering our initial startup costs to actually just generating a profit on top of it of about $85 million a year.
Yeah, thank you for walking me through that. So 3 years. So now that we have that 3-year number, tell me about that. What do you think? Is that a lot, a little? Kind of walk me through your thoughts.
I definitely haven't looked at what the break even is for other divisions of sporting goods stores, but 3 years does strike me as fairly quick.
Yeah.
Our hope would be that this, I assume, would be a pretty large division. I think about anytime I'm walking into an academy or any store similar to that. I know we might not be identical, but there are a lot of sections, but each section is pretty substantial. I mean, you have basketball, you have baseball, you have football, you have softball, you have golf, men's golf, women's golf, and so for one of our major kind of product types, to be able to recover all of our costs within 3 years sounds really encouraging. And having $85 million annually build up after that in profit is really, I think, a good sign, especially considering we haven't taken into account any growth rate. I would love to know, as I mentioned earlier, any information about trends of is women's golf growing, is women's golf apparel growing, and maybe even aside from the market growth in general, maybe we can just do a better job of acquiring customers than we're projecting right now and steadily increase our capture rate. And so all this looks pretty promising. I think the number that jumps out to me the most, though, as you mentioned at the very start, we're looking to take our extra cash and use it for a profitable project. This is looking like a very profitable project, but $255 million to start off, it's a lot of cash. I don't know. I know you mentioned we don't have a specific number of cash that we're looking to invest right now, but that is something that does give me a little bit of pause in an otherwise really promising situation.
Yeah, so I agree that 255 does seem like a big number. So let's say maybe Mike Apparel is trying to strategize ways to, they want to enter the market, the women's apparel market, but they don't want to spend that much money. What are some ways they could go about that?
And so do they have to spend that within specifically golf or just some other entry to the market that accomplishes their purposes?
Let's just start specifically with the women's apparel.
Okay. So within women's apparel, I think there's a few routes you could go. If they don't want to spend $255 million to in startup costs, they could go with a more kind of niche sport that might be a little bit cheaper to produce. But my hesitation with that, whether that's women's rowing or women's lacrosse or whatever it might be, is that in some ways it might even be more expensive to do the development just because it's not something that has as many similarities with their other sports. And so niche sports is an idea that they should look into. But I do think actually, this is proven to be, just from our numbers right off the bat, really profitable within women's golf. And there might be a way to enter the women's golf market without going really to the full extent immediately. That might let us test the market and see, are we actually having the returns that we expect? How is the market growing? Because we're going to have 600,000 people, or I guess 3 million people in the U.S. that fit into this range, and we think we can capture 20% of them, it doesn't mean we would only capture 10 if we're only providing half the products, you know? Mm-hmm. And so we still would have 600,000 people that we could sell a shirt to, even if we're not selling the shirt and the hat. And so I would definitely look at, you know, would that cut our startup costs down significantly to just, you know, kind of provide only half the offerings that we maybe would want to in a full launch and do a smaller launch. And maybe even if we want to do a very small test launch, things like women's golf gloves that I know are crucial to the game and probably would cost a lot less than $255 million to start up, but would help us test how able we are to actually reach that market.
Yeah, those are all really good ideas. And so now Mike Apparel CEO walks in. What are you going to tell him or her?
So we should enter the women's golf apparel market. With the information that we know right now, this is looking like a very profitable venture. We can expect to make about $85 million in annual profit, and that will recoup all of our startup costs within just 3 years. And then after that, you know, build up $85 million per year, and we might even be able to grow that if we can increase our capture rate over time, or if the market continues to grow. There are some concerns though. Obviously, we want to look at what we're pushing off the shelves in order to bring this onto the shelf, and is that going to cannibalize some of our current sales? And then on the other side, it's just pretty expensive. Again, I would want to know more about, does Mike Apparel have $255 million worth of cash to spend? If so, this is a great venture. If not, maybe we should, in the short term, look at doing a smaller beachhead into the women's golf apparel market with gloves or with just shirts or with just hats. And then in the long term, I think it's really important for us to consider how do we increase our capture rate. 20% is a really good capture rate, but if we already are a well-established large sports apparel brand, people are already used to us, and maybe we can establish ourselves as the long-term leader in women's golf apparel, such that that's perhaps our highest capture rate among any of our product divisions.
Great. You did a great job.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
All right, everyone, great job. You're done. Now let's hop into the 3-minute drill for some feedback. There are 3 things that I thought Scott did really well in this case: asking clarifying questions, charting a path for his math, and remaining focused on the overall question. Let's dive into each point more specifically. So Scott asked really good clarifying questions after I explained the case to him. This showed me that he thought of this case as a real-world business problem. Really, for any market entry case, you want to ask why this company is trying to enter this market in the first place. The answer you get will ultimately help keep you focused throughout the case and in your final recommendation. It's also good to ask, in any type of case, what other objectives you might need to be aware of. Here's a look at how Scott asked his clarifying questions.
Is there any specific reason that women's golf apparel is what we're looking at right now? Are there any other objectives I should be aware of?
When I asked Scott to do the market sizing, he did a great job of staying organized and showing me how he was planning to solve it. It involved a lot of steps and assumptions, so he could have easily seemed lost. But by laying out his process ahead of time, he was able to maintain control and make the math easier on himself. Let's watch how he starts the math by doing this.
I would think about, the total U.S. market, and then a total number of women in the U.S., and then from that.
And last, Scott did a great job of keeping the overall objective of the case in mind. This really helped him focus on what was most important, without getting off track. It helped that Scott wrote those big questions at the top of his page, and he could consistently look back at them throughout the case. So then he could relate each part of the case to those questions, and make sure that he was answering them in the conclusion. Here's a great example.
As you mentioned at the very start, we're looking to take our extra cash and use it for a profitable project.
Thanks, Jake. 2 ways I could have improved on this case include being more concise when explaining my framework and better structuring my thoughts during the brainstorming section. While it is good that I explained my framework and why I wanted to approach the problem that way, I spent more time explaining each part than I needed to. This made me seem less confident because I acted like I needed to justify everything that I was doing. A great explanation of the framework will include a quick high-level overview and then do a better job of explaining my hypothesis, or my best guess at where we should start the case. When Jake asked me to give my thoughts on different ways to enter the women's apparel market, he was basically asking me to brainstorm. While brainstorming can be unstructured and off the cuff, mine appeared too all over the place, and more structure would have actually been helpful. It's okay to ask for a few seconds to gather your thoughts, and might help you to write down a few words to keep you focused before explaining your ideas.
Awesome. For the last part of the 3-minute drill, let's look at an intangible that Scott demonstrated that you could really benefit from focusing on. One intangible Scott showed well was his curiosity about this case. If you've solved a few cases before, you might have thought this Mike Apparel case is pretty straightforward. But Scott took this to the next level by including personal references from his life and asking me questions that showed me that he was thinking about this problem deeply. This is also going to make the case feel way more conversational, which will leave me as an interviewer way more impressed with you. Here's a few examples of what I'm talking about.
Golf is a bit different. I know in my own experience, I've only gone a few times, and usually I've been kind of upset about how much I had to pay. It's a lot of cash, but that is something that does give me a little bit of pause.
All right, that wraps up the 3-minute drill. Before we head out, though, we have 2 quick pieces of advice to ask from you all.
Number 1, what types of cases do you want to see us run? Number 2, what do you find hardest about cases that you want more advice on? Jake and I read and discuss every one of our comments, and so make sure to comment down below.
Thank you all so much for watching. We believe case prep shouldn't be stressful, so we're going to do everything we can to make sure you're feeling good. If that sounds helpful to you, make sure to subscribe and have a great day.
Number 1, what type...
The third time always gets me. Thank you all. Thank you all so much.